The night was too quiet for Richmond. The kind of quiet that presses against your chest, makes the hairs on your arms stand tall, and tells you that something has gone terribly wrong. The moon hung low and pale, reluctant to shine too brightly on what had been done. Its light washed over the cobblestones, slick and shining with something darker than rain. A dog howled in the distance, sharp, frantic, and was answered by another, and then another, until the sound carried like a warning through the alleys and along the riverbank. Doors bolted, shutters closed. People huddled in their beds, their breathing shallow, afraid to know but more afraid not to. 10 men were dead. Overseers, men who had spent their lives barking orders, swinging whips, and making others bleed. Now they lay scattered across Richmond, their faces twisted in shock, their bodies broken in ways that even the hardest men of the city recoiled from. And through the chaos, through the smoke and the whispers, her name moved like a shadow. Lucy. They said she had been calm, that her hands had not trembled, not even once, that her eyes, those dark, steady eyes, never blinked as she carried out what many would call madness, and what others would come to understand as something far more deliberate. By dawn, the city was a cage of fear. Mothers pulled children closer. Men gripped their rifles tighter, searching the streets for a ghost they could not find. And beneath it all ran a single, chilling question. What could drive a woman, one they thought powerless, to carve her fury so deeply into the bones of a city? This is the part of history they tried to bury. A story whispered in back rooms and over low flames. A story never printed in the papers because it spoke of power in the hands of someone who was never meant to hold it. But history has a way of breathing through the cracks, of keeping its ghosts alive in the places that tried, hardest to forget. And Lucy, quiet, steady, unbroken Lucy, is one of those ghosts. What Richmond remembers as a night of horror began long before that moon ever rose, long before the screams, the dogs, and the stunned silence of a city too afraid to speak her name. If you listen closely, if you let yourself stand in the stillness of that night, you can almost hear it. Her footsteps, steady and sure, moving through the dark with purpose. But the quiet did not last, because this was never just a story about rage. It was about something deeper, something inevitable. And to understand why Lucy turned her hands to vengeance, you have to go back to the world that built her silence, back to the place where her anger was first born. And it starts in the heart of Richmond. Richmond, in the summer of 1848, pulsed with contradiction. Along the James River, the docks groaned under the weight of crates filled with tobacco, cotton, and the bitter fruits of enslaved labor. Barges creaked against their moorings as men shouted orders, their voices echoing across the water, sharp and impatient. The air was thick with the sharp, acrid smell of cured tobacco and horse sweat, the tang of smoke clinging to every surface, every breath. In the streets, wagon wheels clattered over uneven cobblestones, and the iron shoes of horses struck sparks that vanished into the choking heat. It was a city alive with motion, but beneath the surface, there was another world entirely. Down, narrow alleys and behind the walls of sprawling estates, the enslaved moved in quiet patterns, measured and cautious. Every step, every glance was calculated, weighed against the unpredictable moods of the men who claimed to own them. For Lucy, life was not free, but it was precise. She had learned early how to keep her head down, how to let silence shield her, how to read the tremor in an overseer's voice that warned of danger before the first lash fell. Among the horses, though, she found something different. There, in the cool dimness of the stable, with the soft rustle of hay and the steady rhythm of breathing animals, she could almost forget. One horse in particular, a tall black stallion, with a narrow blaze of white that ran down the bridge of his nose, had become hers in ways no man could understand. She whispered to him when the nights felt too long, buried her face in his neck when fear threatened to swallow her whole. In his quiet strength she found something close to peace. But peace was fragile here always. Overseers stalked the grounds like carrion birds, their tempers quick, their cruelty casual. They barked orders with whips dangling at their sides, voices sharp enough to cut. There were small rebellions, quiet ones, an extra scoop of grain to the workhorse, a hidden smile between two field hands, a whispered song that slipped through the dark like a prayer. But these small acts did little to dull the weight pressing down on every hour of every day. Lucy bore it all with a stillness that made others uneasy. She did not weep where they could see her. She did not raise her voice, not even when the overseer with the scarred cheek shoved her hard enough to bruise. And perhaps that was why they hated her all the more. That unshakable calm, that refusal to break where others had shattered. The summer heat was relentless, clinging to skin and clothing, turning the nights heavy and airless. Tempers flared like dry tinder, and the smallest spark could set a man to violence. Lucy felt it building. The stares that lingered too long, the sharp words that came quicker now, the sense that something was coming though she could not yet name it, and always in the background, the sound of that black stallion shifting in his stall, his hooves striking against the boards steady and familiar. She clung to that sound like a lifeline, unaware of how soon it would be silenced. By the time the first blow fell, by the time blood stained the hay and the night filled with a hollow, keening silence, Richmond was already primed. The city had built its world on the backs of people like Lucy, never imagining what might happen if the weight became too much to bear. And in that gathering storm, the quiet that had once been her armor began to sharpen into something else entirely. Something colder, something dangerous. Because storms, once they start, do not stop until they have torn everything in their path apart. The summer had turned cruel. By August, the heat hung thick over Richmond, pressing down like a curse. Tempers frayed. Overseers barked orders with sharper edges, their hands quick to strike. Lucy kept her silence, the same silence that had shielded her for years. But now that silence drew their eyes. They saw it as defiance, a quiet they could not break. And that made them meaner. One evening, the scarred overseer, the one with the crooked nose and the voice like gravel, spat at her, feet as she walked by, his laughter cutting through the still air. Others joined in, jeering, their voices cruel and slurred with drink. Lucy did not look at them. She never did. She walked on, her hands steady, her eyes fixed ahead. But something inside her shifted, a slow turn of gears that none of them could. Here and then one morning the stable went silent. She smelled it before she saw it. The copper bite of blood heavy in the humid air, clinging to the hay like a sickness. The black stallion, her one solace, lay broken in the straw, his dark coat slashed and slick, the white blaze on his face smeared red. His eyes, once alive and bright, were dull now, frozen in a question that had no answer. Lucy stood there for a long time, her hands at her sides, her breathing slow. She knelt beside him, her fingers brushing his mane, feeling the cold that had already started to creep in. Around her the world narrowed, the buzzing of flies, the drip of blood onto packed earth, the muffled voices of men laughing somewhere beyond the stable walls. Not an accident. A message. She did not cry. She did not scream. The grief came sharp and deep, but it did not spill out. It settled inside her instead, hardening, turning the quiet that had once been her refuge into something sharper, something colder. That night she lay awake in the quarters, her eyes open, her body still. Around her the others whispered, their voices low and fearful. They spoke of curses, of punishment, of what might come next, but Lucy said nothing. She was somewhere else entirely, in that still, cold place where rage stops burning and starts planning. In the days that followed, she moved with the same calm precision, but there was a difference now, a weight in her step, a steady rhythm in her breathing that others felt but could not name. She listened. She learned the patterns of the men who laughed at her pain. She counted the hours they drank themselves senseless, the routes they walked when the night turned quiet, the places where the shadows fell thick enough to swallow a scream. Children watched her with wide eyes. Grown men avoided her gaze. The air in the quarters shifted, heavy with something they could not yet understand. Even the nights grew uneasy, the cicadas falling silent when she walked past, as if the world itself recognized what she had become. Did the overseers sense it? Did they feel the shift in the air, the faint hum of something terrible gathering just out of sight? If they did, they ignored it. They drank, they mocked, they called her by names meant to cut. They never imagined that the quiet they had always mistaken for weakness had begun to sharpen itself into a weapon. By the time the first frost threatened the edges of the fields, Lucy's plan was complete. She carried it like a second skin, invisible but always present, her every move a step toward something inevitable. There was no rush in her, no wildness, just that same calm, steady silence that had always defined her. Only now, it carried the weight of what was coming. And Richmond, oblivious, carried on. The city bustled, the overseers swaggered, the chains rattled in the same cruel rhythm as they always had. But in the quiet corners, in the spaces where the light did not reach, something had already shifted. Because vengeance once set in motion is a tide you cannot turn, and Lucy was already standing at the edge of the water, waiting for it to rise. The night did not begin with thunder or warning. It began with silence, a silence so deep it felt alive, pressing against every wall, slipping beneath every door. The air was heavy, damp, thick enough to taste, carrying the sour scent of the river and the faint tang of iron. Lucy moved through it like a shadow, steady, deliberate, her bare feet soundless on the packed earth. Somewhere a dog barked once, sharp and uncertain, then stopped. Even the crickets had gone quiet, as if the land itself understood what was coming. The first house was dark, save for the dull orange glow of a dying fire. Inside, the overseer slept, his breath slow and uneven, a half-empty bottle at his side. Lucy's hands did not tremble as she stepped over the threshold. The steel in her grip was cold and certain, like it had been waiting with her all along. One breath, two, and then the whisper of the blade cutting through the quiet. There was no time for him to wake. No time for fear to bloom. Just the soft, wet sound of a life ending and the steady drip of blood onto the floorboards. She did not look back as she stepped into the night again. The second heard her coming. He was outside, leaning against the porch rail, humming something low and tuneless. His head turned just as she reached him, confusion flashing across his face before it twisted into something darker, fear sharp and sudden. He opened his mouth. Maybe to beg, maybe to curse, but the steel was faster. His scream cut through the night like a blade of its own, jagged and raw, carrying across the fields and into the city. Doors opened, candles flared to life, and somewhere a child began to cry. But Lucy was already gone, melting into the dark before the sound had even finished tearing itself from his throat. The others tried to fight. One swung a lantern, shattering it against the wall in a shower of sparks and oil. Another fired a pistol blind into the night, the gunshot cracking like thunder and then folding into the quiet. But it did not matter. One by one they fell. 10 men who had ruled with whips and chains, undone in the span of a single night. Their disbelief lingered in their eyes, even as the light left them. A silent, final question that would never be answered. How had they never seen her coming? By the time the last body hit the ground, Lucy was slick with sweat, her breath sharp in her chest. The rage that had carried her through each strike burned clean now, leaving behind a strange, chilling calm. She stood among the wreckage and the broken doors, the shattered glass, the still forms cooling in the humid air. And for the first time in years, she felt the weight lift. Not joy, not even relief. Something deeper. Something like peace. By dawn, Richmond was unrecognizable. Smoke curled above the overseer's quarters, black and thin against the pale morning sky. People gathered in tight clusters, whispering, pointing, clutching their children close. The overseers' homes were splintered into chaos, tables overturned, windows broken, walls slick with what had been taken from them. 10 bodies lay still, their power gone, their voices silenced, and in the center of it all, Lucy stood. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable, her eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once. She did not run. She did not hide. She simply waited, as if daring the world to take back what it thought it owned. There are those who say the silence that followed was the loudest sound Richmond had ever known. No birds, no footsteps, no voices. Just that deep, aching quiet stretching out over the fields and the river and into the city itself. It was not the silence of fear, though there was plenty of that, but of reckoning, of something broken finally giving way. And yet, even in that stillness, even in that moment when everything she had carried burned down to ash, there was the faintest hum beneath it all, the hum of what comes after, the hum of a story that would not end with her standing in the ruins but would move forward, whispered from one mouth to another, reshaped with every telling, until no one could be sure where the truth stopped and the legend began. But the quiet did not last. By morning, Richmond was a city split open. The sun rose pale and thin, its light washing over streets that felt foreign, hollowed out. The homes of the overseers were draped in black cloth, their doors flung open for mourners who filed in, clutching handkerchiefs and muttering prayers. The women wept into their sleeves, their sobs sharp and unrelenting, while the men spoke in tight, clipped voices, trying to name the unnameable. Madness, they called it. Devil's work, some whispered. Anything but what it truly was, a reckoning they had never believed could come. The newspapers followed suit. Ink bled across their pages with words meant to control the story, to soothe the city's raw nerves. They painted Lucy as a beast, a creature twisted by hate, incapable of reason or humanity. Columns dripped with venom, warning that such violence was proof of what happened when order was not kept. Yet even as they condemned her, they could not silence the unease in their own words. Between every line was the quiet admission of a fear they would never speak aloud. They had created her. Patrols scoured the outskirts for days. Men on horseback rode through the woods and along the river, dogs straining at their leashes, their noses pressed to the dirt. They searched the fields, the swamps, even the neighboring counties, convinced Lucy had vanished into the night. But those who truly knew her, the ones who had seen her stillness in those final days, said nothing. They did not believe she had run. They understood this had never been about escape. It had been about balance. And balance, once restored, required no flight. In the quarters, her name moved like smoke, thin and weightless but impossible to hold. Children whispered it to one another in games, daring each other to speak it aloud. To test if the stories were true, mothers hushed them, quickly, their voices low and trembling. "Not so loud," they warned. "She is listening." To the enslaved, Lucy became more than a woman. She became a presence, something that lingered in the cracks of their world, a warning, a promise, a shadow that stretched longer than her life. But above ground, life in Richmond forced itself back into motion. Shops reopened. Church bells rang. The city buried its dead, nailed their doors shut, and told itself the nightmare was over. Yet beneath that fragile quiet, something pulsed, something raw and unhealed. People avoided certain roads after dark. Windows were latched tighter, doors barred earlier. Conversations faltered when her name hovered in the air, unspoken but heavy. It was as if the city itself understood that nothing would ever truly return to the way it had been. And for those who had known her, truly known her, the silence was the hardest part. They had no graves to visit, no marker to press their palms against, only the memory of her eyes in those final days. Calm, steady, endless. They did not grieve her in the way the city expected. They did not need to, because in the quiet moments, when the night was still and the river hummed low and restless, it felt as though Lucy had never left at all. The quiet settled like a second skin, thin but unshakable. People spoke softer, they moved slower, and always, there was that unspoken thought threading through every glance and every silence. If she could rise in the night and remake the story in her own blood, what else might be possible? Time tried to erase her. The men who wrote the city's history folded Lucy into silence, pressing her name between the brittle pages of court records that would never be read. Newspapers stopped printing her story. Families who had lost sons, fathers, and brothers spoke of her only in veiled terms, as if refusing to name her would make the memory less sharp. And for a while, it worked. The city built over its own unease, layer by layer, until Richmond could pretend the night of blood and reckoning had never happened. But silence does not bury everything. In the quarters, her story took root. Around cook fires and in whispered prayers, mothers told their children about the woman who had refused to bow. They spoke her name softly, with reverence and a trace of fear, passing her story like a fragile ember from one generation to the next. To some, Lucy was a warning, proof that even the quietest suffering could harden into something unbreakable. To others, she was freedom made flesh, a reminder that dignity, once claimed, could never be fully stolen. Years blurred into decades. The city changed, the faces changed, and still the whispers never stopped. Field hands spoke of a chill that rolled through the rows on summer nights, cool and sharp, like breath on the back of the neck. Old men swore that in the heavy stillness before a storm you could hear her footsteps, steady, measured, the sound of someone who had once remade the rules in the dark. Even now, some will not walk certain roads after nightfall, not out of fear but out of respect. And perhaps that is the truest legacy she left behind, a quiet that is never quite empty. A reminder that what happened on that night was never about glory, or even rage. It was about balance. It was about reclaiming, for one brief, brutal moment, the dignity they had tried so hard to strip away. In that sense, Lucy never left. Her shadow still lingers in the corners of Richmond, in the creak of a barn door left open, in the low hum of the river when the air grows heavy. History may have chosen to forget her, but the ground remembers. And when the night deepens, when the city holds its breath and the wind carries the smell of rain, some swear they can hear her still. Footsteps moving through the dark, steady, and sure, as if to remind the living that some stories refuse to die.